My name is Audrey, and at 34 years old, I never expected to be homeless. The sound of my $3,000 MacBook Pro shattering against the frozen concrete echoed louder than the howling Chicago wind. I stood there in the snow, shivering in just my thin cardigan, watching the screen flicker and die. That laptop contained 3 years of forensic accounting data, and it was my only source of income. Patricia stood in the open doorway, the warmth of the hallway spilling out behind her like a cruel joke. She pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked at me with pure disgust. "You are just an extra mouth to feed, Audrey," she screamed over the wind. "Do you think money grows on trees? We can barely afford the heating bill as it is, and you have the audacity to take a second serving of steak." I stared at her in disbelief. My hands were already going numb, but my blood was boiling. The steak she was screaming about cost $20 at the grocery store. I knew the price because I was the one who paid for it. In fact, I had paid for the entire grocery haul that week using the credit card I gave to my husband Brandon. But standing there with snow melting into my socks, I realized she truly believed her own lie. To her, I was just the silent wife who clicked away on a computer all day, while her son was the big-shot real estate agent. "Get your trash off my driveway," Patricia spat, pointing at my broken laptop. "Jamal and Courtney are moving into your room tomorrow. At least Jamal brings value to this family. He works on Wall Street. You are just a parasite." I looked past her shoulder, hoping to see Brandon. Hoping my husband of 5 years would step in and tell his mother that I was the one paying the $4,000 mortgage on this apartment every month. I saw his face appear in the living room window. Our eyes locked for a second. I pleaded with him silently. "Just open the door, Brandon. Just tell her the truth." But he didn't. He looked at his mother, then looked at me, shivering in the snow, and he reached up and closed the heavy velvet curtains. The click of the front door lock engaging was the final sound that ended my marriage. I bent down and picked up the shattered remains of my life. The glass from the screen cut into my frozen palm, but I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was a cold clarity. They thought I was a burden. They thought I was weak. As I dragged my suitcase down the icy driveway, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to just survive this. I was going to own them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rebuild your life after someone you loved betrayed you. Just before I could even grip the handle of my suitcase, the heavy oak door swung open again. It was not Brandon coming to save me. It was Jamal. He stepped onto the snowy porch, wearing the silk pajamas I had paid for with my Christmas bonus last year. He looked down at me with a sneer that twisted his face into something ugly. "Move it, Audrey!" He barked, his breath puffing out in the freezing air. "You are blocking the driveway, and Courtney needs the feng shui to be perfect. She is turning your old office into her new live streaming studio tonight." I froze. My office. The room where I had spent countless nights auditing financial statements to pay off their credit card debts. They were not just kicking me out, they were erasing me. Courtney appeared behind him, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of her latest iPhone. She was already recording. She did not even look at me directly, only through the screen of her phone. "Hey guys, big updates for the channel," she chirped using that fake high-pitched voice she reserved for her followers. "We are doing a massive declutter to welcome the new year. Out with the old toxic energy and in with the abundance. Watch us take out the trash." She panned the camera down to me, shivering in the snow. I saw myself on her screen, a broken woman in a thin coat. But then I looked at her feet. She was wearing the $1,200 Balenciaga boots I had bought her for her birthday, because she claimed she needed them for her image. "You are wearing my boots, Courtney," I said, my voice trembling slightly from the cold. She laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Consider it a rental fee for all the space you took up in our house. Now go." I reached for my suitcase, but Jamal stepped forward. With a swift, arrogant motion, he kicked the side of my bag. It slid across the ice and slammed into a snowbank, popping the zipper open slightly. My clothes spilled out onto the dirty slush. I said, "Move," he shouted. "Get your junk out of here. We do not want to see your face when we wake up." Something inside me snapped. The tears that had been threatening to fall suddenly evaporated. The sadness was replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like steel in my spine. I did not scramble to pick up my clothes. I stood up slowly and brushed the snow off my coat. I looked straight into Jamal's eyes. I did not blink. I did not look away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance faltering for just a second under my gaze. "What are you staring at, loser?" he spat. "You will regret that kick, Jamal," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the wind like a knife. "You have no idea what you just started." He laughed, but it sounded nervous this time. He grabbed Courtney's arm and pulled her back inside. "Go find a shelter, Audrey. The adults have business to discuss." The door slammed shut again, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I was alone in the dark with my ruined laptop and my frozen clothes. But as I zipped my bag back up, I wasn't shaking anymore. They wanted a show for Courtney's live stream. I decided right then and there that I would give them a finale they would never forget. I dragged my soaked suitcase to the curb and hailed the first taxi I saw. The back seat smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine air freshener, but at least it was warm. I told the driver to head toward the downtown hotel district. I figured I would book a room at the Marriott for a few nights while I sorted out my life. My hands were still shaking uncontrollably as I pulled out my phone to check my bank balance. I knew I had exactly $12,500 in our joint savings account. It was money I had secretly set aside for a down payment on a house of our own, far away from Patricia and her toxicity. I opened the banking app and felt my heart stop beating. The screen blinked back at me. Available balance, $0.00. I blinked, thinking it was a glitch due to the poor signal in the snowstorm. I refreshed the page. Still zero. I frantically scrolled down to the transaction history, and there it was. 1 hour ago, a transfer of $12,500 to Patricia's personal account. The memo line read, "Mother's emotional support fee." I felt like I was going to throw up right there in the cab. Brandon hadn't just watched his mother kick me out. He had financed it. He stole my entire safety net to pay her for the inconvenience of tolerating me. He left me penniless in a blizzard. "Driver," I said, my voice cracking. "Change of plans." The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror, waiting. I didn't have money for the Marriott. I realized with a surge of panic that I didn't even have money for this taxi ride. My credit cards were likely maxed out by Patricia's shopping sprees. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over my parents' number. Number 1. I couldn't tell them yet. They would just say I told you so. I found the number for Mark, a junior analyst on my team. It was 11:30 at night, but I had no other choice. He picked up on the second ring. "Mark. I need a favor," I whispered, hating how desperate I sounded. "I need you to Venmo me $200. I will explain later." There was a long pause. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't ask why a senior accountant needed lunch money. "Done," he said simply. "No questions asked." I breathed out a sigh of relief as the notification popped up. I had the driver drop me off at a Motel 6 near the highway exit. It was $49 a night, and the neon sign outside buzzed with a dying flicker. As I hauled my suitcase into the room with its stained carpet and lumpy mattress, I realized Brandon thought he had won. He thought taking my money would break me. He forgot that I was a forensic accountant. I didn't just know how to make money. I knew how to track every dirty cent he had ever hidden. And I was going to make sure that $12,000 was the most expensive theft he ever committed. The room at the Motel 6 smelled of bleach and decades of bad decisions. The neon sign outside flickered, creating a rhythmic buzzing sound that seemed to mock my situation. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. It was midnight. My husband had not called. My mother-in-law was probably sleeping soundly in the heated master bedroom I paid to renovate last summer. I reached into the hidden lining of my suitcase. Being a forensic accountant meant I never trusted anyone completely, not even my own family. It was a habit I couldn't break. I unzipped the secret compartment and pulled out a thick plastic envelope. Inside were the receipts of my so-called burden. I spread them out on the cheap polyester bedspread. They looked like innocent slips of paper, but to me, they were evidence. There was the electric bill for the heated floors Patricia demanded. $400 a month. Next to it was the monthly lease on Brandon's Mercedes, which he told his friends was a company car, $900 a month. Then there was the country club membership Patricia insisted was vital for networking, $2,000. I ran the numbers in my head because I didn't need a calculator for this. I knew exactly where every cent had gone. In the last 3 years alone, I had quietly injected $180,000 into the family that just threw me out like garbage. They called me an extra mouth to feed, but I was actually the one putting food on the table. I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had been the bank for a group of emotional terrorists. They didn't kick me out because I was expensive. They kicked me out because they thought they had finally drained me dry. They thought I was empty. I stood up and wiped the dust off the motel desk. My MacBook screen was shattered black spiderwebs of glass obscuring the display. But the processor was still running. I could hear the fan whirring. I found an HDMI cable in my bag and connected the laptop to the dusty television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying my desktop on the 32-inch TV. The colors were distorted, but the text was readable. I didn't open my email to beg Brandon for money. I didn't text Patricia to apologize. I opened a fresh document. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I typed the words with a strange sense of calm. I listed every asset, every debt, and most importantly, I listed the dates of every single transfer I had ever made to them. I was treating my marriage exactly like a failed business merger. If they wanted a war, I would give them a nuclear winter. I saved the file as the end.doc and finally turned off the light, ready for the morning that would change everything. I woke up to the sound of a semi-truck backfiring on the highway outside my window. My neck was stiff from the lumpy motel pillows, and for a split second, I forgot where I was. Then the smell of stale cigarette smoke hit me, and the reality of my life came rushing back. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. There was a single text message from Brandon. It had come in at 6:30 in the morning. I braced myself, expecting an apology. Maybe he had finally grown a spine. Maybe he had realized that throwing his wife into a blizzard was insane. I opened the message. "Did you apologize to Mom yet? She is willing to be generous. She says if you come back today and literally get on your knees to beg for forgiveness, she might let you sleep in the garage until you find a place. It is heated, so you should be grateful. Don't be stubborn, Audrey." I stared at the screen. The garage. He wanted me to sleep next to the lawnmower and the oil stains. He wanted me to kneel. A cold numbness washed over me. I did not type a reply. I did not scream. I simply pressed the info button on his contact profile, scrolled to the bottom, and hit block caller. Then I did the same for Patricia. Then Jamal. Then Courtney. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was the first time in 5 years I felt truly free. I showered with the tiny bar of gritty motel soap and put on my clothes from yesterday. My pencil skirt was wrinkled and my silk blouse had a water stain on the collar from the snow. I looked like a wreck. But when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my eyes were different. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating fire. I walked into my firm, Sterling and Associates 20 minutes late. The receptionist. Brenda looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my wrinkled skirt. "Rough night, Audrey?" she asked with a judgmental smirk. "You have no idea, Brenda," I said, walking past her without stopping. I went straight to my desk, ignoring the whispers of my colleagues. I had just sat down when my boss, Mr. Henderson, called me into his glass-walled office. He looked serious. "Audrey, I have a sensitive file," he said, sliding a thick manila folder across his mahogany desk. "This is a forensic audit for a real estate holding company. They are bleeding cash and the IRS suspects massive fraud. We need our best eyes on it immediately. They are trying to liquidate assets quietly to avoid federal charges." I opened the file. The name at the top of the page made my heart stop. Ellington Heights Management, LLC. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the address listed on the primary asset, 4500 Lakeshore Drive. It was the building I had just been kicked out of. It was the building where Patricia was currently drinking her morning coffee and laughing about me sleeping in a garage. Mr. Henderson continued talking, unaware of the bomb he had just dropped. They need a buyer for the building by Friday. The market value is $15 million, but they are desperate. They will likely take half that just to clear the tax lien. I ran my finger over the address. Fate wasn't just knocking on my door, it was handing me a sledgehammer. I will take the case, I said, my voice steady. In fact, Mr. Henderson, I think I might know a buyer who can move very quickly. I walked back to my desk, my wrinkled clothes forgotten. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a shark who had just smelled blood in the water. I stared at the document in front of me, and for the first time in 24 hours, the cold knot in my stomach began to loosen. The file Mr. Henderson had handed me was not just a standard audit. It was an autopsy of a dying company. Titan Real Estate Group was the parent company that owned the Ellington Heights, and they were drowning in debt. They had over-leveraged themselves on bad commercial loans in Florida, and now they needed to liquidate their prime Chicago assets immediately to avoid bankruptcy. My eyes scanned the spreadsheet with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. I knew how to read these numbers better than anyone. I saw the panic in the margins. I saw the desperation in the slashed prices. And then I saw it. The entry that made my pulse race faster than it ever had before. Asset number 402, the Ellington Heights Residential Complex, 4500 Lakeshore Drive. Current occupancy rate 98%. Market valuation $15.2 million. But it was the next line that made me gasp out loud in the quiet office. Distress liquidation price $8.2 million. Cash offer required. Must close within 48 hours. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and felt a smile spread across my face. It was a terrifying price for a normal investor. Nobody kept $8 million in cash lying around, and no bank would underwrite a commercial loan in 2 days without months of due diligence. That was why the price was so low. Titan Real Estate was banking on a miracle or a shark. They didn't care which. I looked at the photo of the building attached to the file. I saw the limestone facade that Patricia bragged about to her bridge club. I saw the wrought iron balconies where Brandon liked to smoke his cigars and pretend he was a tycoon. I saw the heated driveway where I had been humiliated less than a day ago. They were living in a house of cards, and they didn't even know it. They thought they were safe in their rent-controlled luxury, oblivious to the fact that their landlord was about to sink. If a corporation bought this, they would simply renovate and raise rent slowly. But if I bought it, I did the math in my head. $8.2 million. It was an astronomical sum. But I wasn't just an accountant. I was the whistleblower on the biggest corporate fraud case in Illinois history. And that reward money was sitting in a secure trust account waiting for me to give the command. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the liquidator listed on the front page of the file. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. It was steady as a rock. "This is Audrey," I said when the agent answered. "I am looking at the Titan portfolio. I am not interested in the commercial lots. I want the Ellington. And I can wire the full amount today." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then the agent stammered. "The full amount. Ma'am, that is over $8 million. We need proof of funds." "I will have the letter from my bank on your desk in 10 minutes, I replied. "But I have one condition. The sale must be done through a blind trust. The current tenants and the management staff cannot know who the new owner is until the ink is dry." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. The snow was still falling, covering the city in white. But the storm inside me was just getting started. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to become their landlord. Just as I reached for the phone to call the liquidator, my personal cell phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. It was a number I had not heard from in 6 months. It was my attorney regarding a qui tam whistleblower case I had filed 3 years ago. Back then, I had discovered a massive invoicing fraud at a pharmaceutical company I was auditing. I had reported it to the SEC and the IRS, risking my entire career for the truth. "Audrey, are you sitting down?" the attorney asked, his voice thick with excitement. "The Department of Justice just finalized the settlement with Biotech Industries. They agreed to pay $40 million in fines. And per the whistleblower statute, your share has been authorized for immediate disbursement. I felt the room spin. I knew the law entitled me to a percentage of the recovered funds, but I had assumed the case would drag on for another decade. Check your secure trust account, Audrey, he said. It cleared this morning. I logged into my private banking portal, my fingers trembling slightly. The screen loaded, and there it was, a wire transfer from the United States Treasury. The number was so large it looked like a mistake. $3,842,000.50. I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since the moment Patricia threw me out. $3.8 million, post-tax. It was more money than Brandon would make in 10 lifetimes. It was enough to buy a mansion in the Hamptons. It was enough to retire to Italy. But I didn't want a villa in Tuscany. I wanted justice. I looked back at the file for the Ellington Heights. The distressed price was $8.2 million. With $3.8 million in cash, I had nearly 50% of the purchase price ready to deploy. In the world of commercial real estate, cash is king. With a down payment that massive, I could secure a bridge loan for the remainder within hours. I picked up my office phone and dialed Jonathan, a senior director at a private investment bank, who owed me a favor. "Jonathan, it is Audrey," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "I am sending you a wire for $3.8 million. I need you to execute a leveraged buyout of a distressed asset immediately. The target is Titan Real Estate's holding at 4500 Lakeshore Drive." "Audrey, that is a distressed asset," Jonathan warned. "It is risky. I am not buying it for the yield," Jonathan, I interrupted. "I am buying it for the control. I want the deed in the name of a shell company. Nemesis Holdings, LLC. Can you close by Friday? If you have the cash, we can close by tomorrow," he replied. "Do it," I said. I hung up the phone and walked over to the window. I looked down at the snowy streets of Chicago. Patricia was probably sitting in her living room right now, sipping tea and telling her friends how she had successfully purged the family of a burden. She had no idea that the burden just became her landlord. And unlike her, I always collected my debts. The next 48 hours were a blur of high-stakes legal maneuvering that made my forensic accounting career feel like a warm-up. While Brandon was likely sending me angry texts about his unwashed laundry, I was busy executing a hostile takeover of his entire existence. I did not go home. I slept on the leather couch in my office and survived on espresso and the adrenaline of pure revenge. My lawyer rushed the paperwork through the Delaware corporate registry system. We needed a shell company to hold the deed, a legal entity that would shield my identity until the trap was fully set. When the form asked for the name of the LLC, I didn't hesitate. I picked up my pen and wrote Nemesis Holdings LLC. In Greek mythology, Nemesis was the goddess of divine retribution against those who succumbed to hubris. It felt appropriate. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 45th floor of a downtown skyscraper. Across from me sat the panicked executives from Titan Real Estate. They looked exhausted. They were desperate to close this deal before the weekend so they could pay off their creditors. They had no idea that the woman in the sharp navy suit sitting across from them was the same woman who had been kicked out of their building 3 days ago for eating too much steak. I slid a stack of documents across the mahogany table. My finger rested on a specific clause on page 52. "This is a strict, non-disclosure agreement," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "The tenants of Ellington Heights are to be informed only that the building has been acquired by Nemesis Holdings. My name does not appear on any public notice. My face does not appear in any newsletter. To them, the new landlord is a faceless entity." The Titan CEO nodded vigorously, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Of course. We understand. Anonymous ownership is standard for high-net-worth portfolios. We just need the wire transfer to clear." I checked my laptop. The $3.8 million down payment along with the bridge loan financing had just hit the escrow account. The money was gone from my trust, but I didn't feel poorer. I felt powerful. I signed the final deed transfer with a flourish. The ink was barely dry when the CEO stood up to shake my hand. "Congratulations on the acquisition," he said. "It is a beautiful building." Though I should warn you there are a few difficult tenants on the fourth floor. I suppressed a smile. I know, I said. I am looking forward to dealing with them personally. As I walked out of that skyscraper with the deed to 4500 Lakeshore Drive in my briefcase, the sun was finally coming out. I wasn't homeless anymore. I was the owner of a $15 million fortress. And the first order of business for Nemesis Holdings was about to begin. I took out my phone and dialed the number for the building's property manager. It was time to introduce myself, not as Audrey the Burden, but as the new boss. While I was high above the city signing the papers that would seal their fate, life at the Ellington Heights apartment continued in its bubble of delusional grandeur. Patricia was hosting her weekly bridge club in the living room I had decorated. She poured a glass of Chardonnay for her friend Linda and let out a dramatic sigh of relief. Honestly, Linda, it feels like the air quality in here has improved since we got rid of her, Patricia said, her voice carrying that sickly sweet tone she used when she was gossiping. Audrey was just such a drain on our energy, always tapping away on that laptop, always looking miserable. The apartment finally feels spacious again now that the extra mouth is gone. Linda nodded sympathetically, unaware that the wine she was drinking was paid for by the very woman Patricia was trashing. Just then, Brandon shuffled into the room. He looked disheveled. His designer suit was wrinkled, and he had the desperate look of a man who had realized his golden goose had flown the coop. He ignored the guests and walked straight to his mother. "Mom, I need $80, he mumbled. The Mercedes is on empty and I have a showing in Naperville in an hour. Patricia's smile faltered. She swirled her wine glass aggressively. "Excuse me, Brandon, we have guests. And why are you asking me for gas money? You are a luxury real estate agent. Use your own card." I tried. Brandon whined, his voice rising an octave. "The joint account is closed." Audrey shut it down. "My corporate card was linked to her credit." "Mom, I literally cannot drive my car." Patricia's face turned a shade of crimson that matched her lipstick. She slammed her glass down on the coffee table. "Do not speak that ungrateful woman's name in this house. She is trying to manipulate us, Brandon. Don't let her win." She reached into her purse and pulled out a wad of cash, the cash she had stolen from our savings. "Here, take 100. But this is the last time. Go sell a house and stop embarrassing me." As Brandon grabbed the cash and hurried out, he nearly collided with Jamal, who was striding in from the hallway, like he owned the place. Jamal was beaming, adjusting his silk tie in the hallway mirror. "Ladies, ladies," Jamal announced, spreading his arms wide. "I hope you are enjoying the view. Take a good look, because things are about to change around here." "What are you talking about, Jamal?" Patricia asked, her mood instantly lifting at the sight of her favorite son-in-law. "I just got intel from my contacts on Wall Street," Jamal lied smoothly. "Titan Real Estate is liquidating this building. They are desperate. I am putting together a syndicate to make a bid." The Bridge Club ladies gasped in admiration. "You mean you are going to buy the Ellington?" Linda asked. Jamal winked. "I am going to buy the whole block. By next week I won't just be a tenant. I will be the landlord. Imagine that, Patricia. No more rent. We will own the castle." Patricia clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, Jamal, I always knew you were the visionary of this family. Unlike some people who just take up space." They raised their glasses in a toast to their future ownership. They clinked crystal goblets and laughed, oblivious to the fact that the building had already been sold. They were celebrating the victory that belonged to the woman they had left in the snow. And they had no idea that the new landlord was not Jamal, but the extra mouth who was about to swallow them whole. The service elevator ride to the roof took exactly 45 seconds. I stood alone in the metal box, watching the floor numbers climb. In my hand, I held a heavy brass ring containing the master keys to the Ellington Heights. The property manager had handed them over to me in the lobby 5 minutes ago, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had tried to call me Mrs. Vance, my married name, but I corrected him immediately. "It is Ms. Sterling," I had said, "and you will not speak to anyone in apartment 402 about this meeting." The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical clank, revealing the vast expanse of the rooftop. The wind up here was fierce, whipping off Lake Michigan with enough force to knock a person over, but I stood firm. I walked across the gravel surface, the sound of my boots crunching rhythmically in the silence. I wasn't just standing on a roof. I was standing on top of my new empire. I walked to the edge of the parapet and looked down. The building was designed in a U-shape, creating a courtyard in the center. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the fourth-floor windows. Specifically, apartment 402. The lights were blazing inside. Through the sheer curtains, I could see the silhouette of Patricia holding court in the living room. I saw Jamal's animated gestures, likely bragging about the building he would never buy. I saw the shadow of Courtney pacing, probably trying to find the best lighting for a selfie. They looked so small from up here, like ants in a glass jar. I looked down at the keys in my hand. These were not just door keys. They were the keys to the infrastructure of their lives. I held the key to the electrical room, which controlled their heated floors. I held the key to the server closet, which controlled their high-speed internet. I held the key to the water main. For years, they had controlled my environment. They decided when I could speak, when I could eat, and where I could sleep. They had reduced my world to a guest room, and then to a garage. Now the roles were reversed. I controlled the very walls that sheltered them. I controlled the heat that warmed them. I owned the ground beneath their feet. A dark sense of satisfaction washed over me, hotter than the anger I had felt in the snow. They were down there drinking wine and celebrating my departure, thinking they had won. They had no idea that the monster they created was standing right above their heads, holding the keys to their destruction. I tightened my grip on the cold brass ring until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't going to evict them immediately. That would be too easy. I was going to use my legal rights as a landlord to inspect every inch of their lives. I was going to expose every lie, every illegal business, and every hidden debt. I took one last look at the warm, glowing window of apartment 402 and whispered into the howling Chicago wind, "Welcome to hell, mother." The following morning, every tenant in the Ellington Heights woke up to a creamy white envelope slid under their door. It was heavy cardstock embossed with a silver logo that simply read Nemesis Holdings, LLC. Inside was a letter that was polite but firm. It stated that due to the change in ownership, a mandatory inspection of all units would be conducted within 48 hours to assess the structural integrity and compliance with lease agreements. Most tenants read it with a shrug. They knew inspections were standard procedure when a building was sold, but in apartment 402, the reaction was very different. Patricia was sitting at her kitchen island wearing a silk robe and eating an ace-high bowl that cost $18. She picked up the envelope with two manicured fingers, as if it were contaminated. She ripped it open, her eyes scanning the text with growing irritation. Mandatory inspection, she scoffed, throwing the letter onto the marble counter. Who do these people think they are? I have lived here for 20 years. I am not some college student in a dorm room. Brandon, who was frantically searching the cabinets for protein powder, looked up. Maybe we should just let them in, Mom. You know the lease says they have the right to inspect. Patricia laughed, a harsh barking sound. They have the right to inspect peasants, Brandon, not us. We are the soul of this building. I am not letting some low-level property manager stomp around my house in his dirty boots. She grabbed the heavy cardstock and tore it in half. Then she tore it again. She dropped the pieces into the trash can with a look of utter disdain. I am not available, she declared, smoothing her robe. I have a spa appointment tomorrow, and then I am meeting the event planner for the charity gala. If they want to inspect something, they can inspect the hallway. She didn't know that the person reading that letter wasn't a low-level manager, it was me. And I had anticipated her arrogance. In fact, I was counting on it. Her refusal to cooperate wasn't an act of strength. It was a breach of contract. And in the world of high-stakes real estate, a breach of contract was the first step toward an eviction. I sat in my office watching the notification pop up on my landlord portal. Unit 402. Status refused entry. I smiled. She had just walked right into the first trap. By tearing up that letter, she hadn't just ignored a notice. She had handed me the legal ammunition I needed to escalate the war. I picked up my phone and dialed the building's head of security. "Prepare the master keys," I said. "We are doing an emergency inspection of Unit 402, citing a potential safety hazard. And bring a camera. We are going to document everything." At 9 o'clock sharp, I stood outside the familiar mahogany door of apartment 402. I was not wearing my usual tailored suit or my heels. Instead, I was dressed in a gray maintenance jumpsuit, a heavy canvas cap pulled low over my eyes, and a thick N95 mask that covered half my face. To the world, I was just another anonymous worker sent to check the pipes. To the people inside, I was an invisible servant. Beside me stood Mike, the head of building security, and a certified structural engineer we had hired for the morning. Mike rang the doorbell. We waited. Silence. He rang it again. Still nothing. "Maintenance check." Mike announced loudly, his voice booming in the hallway. "We have reports of a potential gas leak. We are entering the unit." It was a lie, of course, but under the lease agreement, a suspected safety hazard gave the landlord immediate right of entry. Mike slid the master key into the lock. The tumbler clicked with a heavy mechanical thud. We stepped inside. The apartment smelled of Patricia's cloying rose perfume mixed with the stale odor of dog food. The living room was empty, but I could hear loud pop music thumping from the back of the hallway, specifically from the direction of what used to be my home office. We walked down the corridor, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. I kept my head down, clutching a clipboard to hide my hands. As we rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to my old office was gone. In fact, the entire wall separating the office from the guest bedroom was gone. Courtney was standing in the middle of a construction zone. Dust covered the hardwood floors I had paid to refinish last year. She was holding a ring light in one hand and shouting at a terrified-looking contractor who was sweeping up chunks of drywall. "Be careful with that dust," Courtney screamed. "I have an unboxing video in 5 minutes, and I cannot look like a coal miner. This open concept studio has to be ready today." I stared at the ceiling. The support beam that ran through that wall was structural. By removing it, she had compromised the integrity of the unit above us. It wasn't just a renovation. It was a catastrophic violation of the building code. Mike cleared his throat. "Ma'am, did you have a permit to remove this wall?" Courtney spun around, her eyes narrowing as she looked at us. "Who let you in? And why are you asking me about permits? I am an influencer. I need space." "My mother said it was fine." "Your mother does not own the building," ma'am, Mike said, calmly pulling out a camera. "This is a load-bearing wall. You have just committed a structural violation." Courtney rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. It is just wood and plaster. Stop being dramatic and fix the air conditioning while you are here. It is getting hot in my studio." She turned her back on us, dismissing us as if we were furniture. She didn't notice me stepping forward. She didn't see me pull out my phone and take high-resolution photos of the exposed beams and the piles of debris. She didn't see me zoom in on the electrical wires that had been recklessly cut and taped together with duct tape. I wasn't just documenting a messy room. I was documenting a crime scene. Under the terms of her lease, unauthorized structural modification was grounds for immediate lease termination and full liability for repairs. I did a quick mental calculation. Restoring this wall and checking the structural safety of the unit above would cost at least $40,000. Courtney was busy adjusting her hair in the reflection of her phone screen. "I heard you guys got a new owner," she said absent-mindedly to Mike. "Tell him to stay out of my way. We are the VIP tenants here." I suppressed a laugh behind my mask. I wrote down the time and the extent of the damage on my clipboard. VIP tenants. She had just handed me the sledgehammer I needed to destroy them. And she had done it while wearing a shirt that said, "Good vibes only." After leaving Courtney to choke on her own drywall dust, I signaled for Mike to follow me to the service elevator. We were descending into the belly of the building. The sub-basement was a maze of concrete corridors and humming pipes, a place where the wealthy tenants of Ellington Heights rarely ventured. But I knew this place well. I used to come down here to hide when the insults upstairs became too much to bear. We stopped in front of storage unit 402. Unlike the other wire mesh cages which held Christmas decorations and old bicycles, This one was lined with opaque black plastic sheeting. You could not see inside. And on the latch sat a heavy-duty industrial padlock that looked like it belonged on a bank vault, not a residential storage locker. Mike looked at the lock and then at his clipboard. "This is a violation, ma'am," he said. "Tenants are required to use standard building-issued locks for fire access. This is unauthorized." "Cut it," I said without hesitation. Mike pulled a pair of massive bolt cutters from his belt. With a grunt of effort and a loud metallic snap, the lock fell to the concrete floor. We pulled the door open, and the smell of ozone and packing styrofoam hit us instantly. I stepped inside and clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that made my forensic accountant brain go into overdrive. The unit was packed floor to ceiling with brown cardboard shipping crates. There must have been 300 boxes crammed into the 10 by 10 space. I pulled a penknife from my pocket and sliced the tape on the nearest box. I pulled back the flaps. Inside, nestled in anti-static bubble wrap, were dozens of high-end computer processors. I recognized the brand immediately. These were top-of-the-line chips, the kind that were currently facing a massive global shortage. I moved to the next box. Graphics cards. The next. High-density solid-state drives. I grabbed one of the shipping labels and held it under my light. The return address was a shell company in Shenzhen. There were no custom stamps, no import duty markers, no FDA compliance stickers. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Jamal's mysterious Wall Street deals, his vague explanations about import-export logistics. It all made perfect sense now. He wasn't an investment banker, he was a fence. He was smuggling gray market electronics into the country to avoid tariffs and hoarding them to resell at scalper prices. This wasn't just a lease violation. This was federal tax evasion. This was customs fraud. I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos. I photographed the shipping labels, the serial numbers, and the sheer volume of the inventory. I made sure to get a wide shot showing the unit number 402 clearly visible next to the illicit goods. Jamal had called me a loser. He had kicked my suitcase. He had no idea that I was currently standing in a room that could send him to federal prison for 10 years. Mike was staring at the boxes wide-eyed. "Ma'am, do you want me to call the police?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, closing the box calmly. "The police will come eventually. But first I'm going to let Jamal think he is safe for just a little longer. I want him to feel the walls closing in. Lock it back up, Mike, and put a tamper seal on it. If he touches this, he is tampering with evidence." We walked back to the elevator, leaving the millions of dollars of contraband sitting in the dark. I had come looking for a reason to evict them. I found a reason to bury them. Back in the safety of the management office, I swapped my maintenance cap for my forensic accountant visor. The physical inspection was damning, but the paper trail was lethal. I sat down at the secure terminal and logged into the state business registry database. It took me less than 30 seconds to find what I was looking for. Courtney had not just been playing dress-up for Instagram. She had formed a limited liability company named Courtney's World LLC 6 months ago. I clicked on the filing details. The registered agent address was listed clearly. 4500 Lakeshore Drive, Unit 402. I leaned back in my chair and let out a low whistle. She wasn't just running a business. She was claiming the apartment as a primary commercial workspace to write off her lifestyle expenses on her taxes. I cross-referenced this with her public posts. She had tagged the apartment as her global headquarters. I pulled up the original lease agreement Patricia had signed in 1998. It was a rent-controlled legacy contract that kept their rent at a pitiful $2,200 a month, while everyone else paid triple that. But there was a clause, Clause 14, Section C. The premises shall be used exclusively for residential purposes. Any commercial use without written landlord consent constitutes a material breach of lease and immediate forfeiture of rent control status. I did the math on my calculator. The moment Courtney registered that LLC, she voided their price protection. I pulled up the current market analysis for a 3-bedroom lakefront unit in the Gold Coast. The going rate was $6,600 a month. That was a 300% increase from what they were paying. But I wasn't done. The lease also stipulated a penalty for unauthorized commercial use equal to 200% of the market rate for every month the violation occurred. I started typing the notification. I wasn't just asking for more money. I was presenting them with a bill for backdated damages. Current market rent $6,600. Retroactive commercial use. Penalty for 6 months, $79,200. Total due within 72 hours or face immediate eviction. I looked at the number on the screen. It was enough to bankrupt them twice over. Brandon had told me I was bad with money. He said I didn't understand value. I hit the print button and watched the paper slide out of the tray. I understood value perfectly, and I had just appraised their arrogance at exactly $85,000. I folded the letter with crisp precision. It was time to make a delivery. I did not slide this notification under the door like a coward. I hired a process server, a man named Bruce who looked like a linebacker and carried a badge. I wanted to make sure there was no way Patricia could claim she never received it. I watched from the security camera feed in my office as Bruce knocked on the door of apartment 402 at exactly 10 in the morning. Patricia answered holding a cup of tea. I saw her smile drop the moment Bruce handed her the thick manila envelope and said, "You have been served." She slammed the door, but it was too late. The clock had started ticking. Inside that envelope was a financial death sentence. It wasn't just a warning. It was a demand for payment that I had itemized with the ruthless precision of a forensic accountant. I imagined her opening it. I imagined her reading the first line. Notice of rent adjustment and lease violation penalties. The first item was the rent itself. For 20 years, Patricia had paid a protected rate of $2,200. But thanks to Courtney's registered LLC and the structural damage she caused, that protection was gone. The bold text on the page read, "New monthly rent $6,600 effective immediately." That was a 300% increase. It was the market rate for a luxury unit in the Gold Coast, and she had no choice but to pay it or leave. But I wasn't done. Below that was the penalty for unauthorized renovations, $5,000 for the destruction of the load-bearing wall, and below that was the retroactive penalty for commercial use of a residential space. I leaned closer to the monitor, almost able to hear the scream I knew was coming. The grand total due was printed at the bottom of the page, including the backdated penalties and the immediate repairs. The amount she owed was $89,000. And then came the kicker. The deadline. Payment is due in full via certified check within 72 hours. Failure to remit payment will result in immediate eviction proceedings and a lien placed on all personal assets. I sat back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. It tasted better than any champagne I had ever drunk. Brandon had always told me I was too focused on numbers. He said I didn't understand the emotional side of life. But looking at that total, I realized I understood emotions perfectly. I had just quantified exactly how much their cruelty cost, and the price tag was $89,000 due in 3 days. I watched the camera feed. For a long time, nothing happened, and then suddenly the door to apartment 402 flew open. Brandon ran out into the hallway looking pale and terrified. He was clutching the papers in his hand. He was running toward the elevator. He was coming to find me, but he didn't know that the wife he was looking for didn't exist anymore. The woman waiting for his call was the landlord, and she didn't accept payment and apologies. Inside apartment 402, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogance to absolute hysteria. Through the thin walls, I could hear Patricia screaming. It was not a scream of fear, but of indignation. She was pacing around the living room, knocking over the expensive vases she had bought with my money. "This is illegal!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. $89,000. They cannot do this to me. I am a widow. I am a pillar of this community. Brandon, do something. Call your lawyer friends. Call anyone. Brandon stood in the corner looking like a deer caught in headlights. He knew his lawyer friends would laugh at him. He knew the lease violation was ironclad. He looked at the total amount due and his face went pale. He didn't see a legal problem. He saw a financial black hole. And his first instinct, as always, was to find someone else to fill it. I watched on the monitor as he pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking. I saw my own phone light up on my desk. The caller ID read, Hubby. I let it ring 3 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to doubt. Finally, I picked up, keeping my voice cool and detached. Hello, Brandon. Audrey, baby. Thank God you picked up, he said, breathless. His voice had that fake warmth he always used when he wanted something. Listen, I have been thinking. We were too harsh on you. Mom feels terrible. She has been crying all morning. I watched the screen. Patricia was currently screaming at the housekeeper, not crying. Is that so? I asked, leaning back in my leather chair. Yes, he continued, gaining confidence. She wants you to come home, Audrey. We want our family back together. You can come back today. We will even let you sleep in the guest room eventually. You just need to apologize and show her you are committed to this family. He paused, waiting for my gratitude. When I didn't answer, he dropped the real reason for the call. Actually, there is a small emergency here. Just a misunderstanding with the building management. If you could stop by the bank on your way over and withdraw maybe $10,000 just to smooth things over, that would really show Mom you are serious. Think of it as a peace offering. I almost laughed out loud. He was asking me to pay the penalty for his sister's illegal renovation. He wanted me to fund my own apology. The audacity was breathtaking. $10,000, I repeated slowly. That is a lot of money for an extra mouth, Brandon. I thought I was a financial burden. No, baby, you know we didn't mean that. He stammered. We love you. We just need the cash. Right now. Please, Audrey, if we don't pay, they are talking about eviction. You don't want to see your husband on the street, do you? I looked at the high-definition image of him sweating in his designer suit. I looked at the eviction notice sitting on my desk. Actually, Brandon, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, I think the street might teach you some character. I hung up the phone. I watched him stare at his screen in disbelief. He looked up at Patricia and shook his head. The realization was just starting to dawn on them. The bank of Audrey was closed, and the eviction clock was still ticking. My phone rang again instantly. It was Brandon. I let it ring 5 times before answering, just to remind him who controlled the timeline now. When I finally pressed talk, he didn't even say hello. He was hyperventilating. You hung up on me, he shouted. I am trying to save our marriage, and you hang up on me. Do you have any idea how much stress my mother is under? She is shaking, Audrey. She needs that $10,000 now. I leaned back in my chair, watching the security feed of their hallway. I could see Brandon pacing back and forth, pulling at his hair. I told you, Brandon, I said calmly. I cannot give you $10,000 because I am very busy right now. I am in the middle of allocating my $3.8 million liquid asset portfolio. There was a silence on the line. Then Brandon laughed. It was a manic, terrified sound. $3 million. You are delusional. You have lost your mind from the stress, haven't you? You are probably sitting in a shelter right now hallucinating. You are a broke accountant, Audrey. You have nothing. He was projecting so hard I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Believe what you want, Brandon, I said, but the rent is still due. I hung up again. On the monitor, I saw Brandon throw his phone against the wall. He turned to Jamal, who was adjusting his cufflinks with the arrogance of a man who hadn't yet realized he was already dead in the water. Let me handle this, Jamal said, loud enough for the hallway microphone to pick up. You are too soft, Brandon. These management companies are all the same. They are bureaucrats. They see a strong black man from Wall Street and they get scared. Watch this. I am going to go down there and put the fear of God into them. I watched Jamal stride toward the elevator. He didn't know that the management office was no longer run by the old sleepy landlord. It was staffed by my new team and they were under strict orders. I switched the camera view to the lobby office. My property manager, David, was sitting behind the desk. He looked nervous, but he knew his role. Jamal kicked the office door open. He didn't knock. He stormed in like he owned the building, slamming his fist onto the reception desk. Who is the manager here? He bellowed. David stood up, adjusting his glasses. I am the property manager, sir. How can I help you? You can help me by canceling that ridiculous invoice you sent to apartment 402, Jamal shouted. Do you know who I am? I run a hedge fund. I have lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. If you do not retract that $89,000 bill right now, I will buy this building and fire you personally. I watched with a smile. Jamal was threatening to buy a building he couldn't even afford to rent. Sir David said, his voice steady. The invoice is for lease violations. If you continue to shout, I will have to ask you to leave. Jamal leaned over the desk, his face inches from David's. You are not listening to me, little man. You are going to fix this, or I am going to come back here and make you fix it. Do you understand? That is a promise. He raised a hand, in a threatening gesture, pointing a finger right in David's face. I clicked the save button on the recording software. Jamal had just threatened a building employee on camera. In the state of Illinois, that wasn't just rude, it was assault and harassment, it was a criminal offense. And it was the final nail in the coffin for their defense against eviction. Jamal stormed out, feeling triumphant. He thought he had intimidated the staff. He didn't realize he had just given me the footage I needed to get a restraining order. I picked up the phone and dialed David. Great job, David, I said. You can lock the office door now and call the police non-emergency line. I want a report on file for that threat. We are moving to the next phase. With the threat of eviction looming and Jamal's intimidation tactics failing miserably, Patricia did what she did best. She decided to lie her way out of bankruptcy. She sat at her dining table surrounded by unpaid bills and hatched a plan so audacious it was almost impressive. She would host a charity gala right here in the apartment. She called it the Gold Coast Children's Relief Fund. The pitch was simple. She invited 50 of her wealthiest friends to an exclusive black-tie dinner where the entry fee was $1,000 a plate. She told them the money was going to build an orphanage in Haiti. In reality, every cent was going to pay her back rent and the penalties I had levied against her. I watched the preparations unfold via the hallway cameras with a mixture of disgust and fascination. It was a masterclass in smoke and mirrors. Patricia didn't have money for groceries, let alone a gala, so she leveraged every remaining scrap of credit she had. She hired a high-end catering company, promising to pay them next week. She rented a $10,000 Marquesa gown from a designer boutique, putting down a deposit with a credit card that I knew was maxed out. She even hired a string quartet. The irony was suffocating. Here was a woman facing homelessness, spending thousands of dollars she didn't have to impress people she didn't like in order to steal money for a cause that didn't exist. She was literally robbing imaginary orphans to save her own skin. Courtney was delighted, of course. She saw the gala as the perfect content opportunity to rebrand herself as a philanthropist. I saw her directing the rental crew, shouting at them to be careful with the ice sculpture. Yes, she actually ordered an ice sculpture of a crying angel, while the drywall dust from her illegal renovation was still settling in the other room. I sat in my office analyzing the guest list Patricia had carelessly left on the kitchen counter, which I saw through the zoom lens of the security camera. It read like a who's who of Chicago society. Bankers, doctors, real estate tycoons, people who trusted the Vance name, people who had no idea they were walking into a fundraising trap set by a desperate family on the brink of ruin. Patricia was running around the apartment, instructing the waiters on how to pour the champagne. Make sure the labels are facing the guests, she snapped. We want them to feel generous tonight. She was putting on the performance of her life, playing the role of the benevolent matriarch while frantically trying to cover the stench of desperation. She thought she was clever. She thought she had found a loophole. But she had forgotten one crucial detail. Soliciting funds for a fake charity wasn't just a social faux pas. It was wire fraud. It was a felony. And by hosting it in my building, she had just invited me to the party. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. I told him to clear his schedule for tonight. I wasn't going to stop the party. I was going to let her collect every single check. And then I was going to make sure the only place she went after dinner was a holding cell. I was sitting in the property management office watching the catering trucks unload cases of champagne that I knew Patricia had not paid for when a courier arrived at the front desk. He was carrying a thick, cream-colored envelope with calligraphy, so elaborate it looked like a wedding invitation. The return address was embossed in gold leaf, the Gold Coast Children's Relief Fund. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It wasn't Patricia's. It belonged to Vanessa, a woman who had been my neighbor for 5 years. Vanessa was the kind of person who smiled to your face while judging the brand of your handbag. She was Patricia's lieutenant in the war of social climbing. I opened the envelope. Inside was a ticket to the gala priced at $1,000. But clipped to the ticket was a handwritten note on personalized stationery. Dear Audrey, Patricia mentioned you are going through a rough patch and living in your car. I know the ticket price is steep for you right now, so do not worry about paying. We actually need someone to help check coats at the door since the staffing agency is short. It would be a great way for you to earn some tips and see everyone again. Hope to see you there. Love, Vanessa. I stared at the note. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me humiliated. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing me check their fur coats while they drank champagne on my dime. They wanted to turn me into the help. Most people would have shredded that invitation. Most people would have cried. I did neither. I felt a cold calm settle over me. Vanessa had just made a fatal tactical error. She thought she was inviting a destitute ex-wife to serve as a prop for their amusement. She didn't realize she had just handed me a legitimate reason to enter the apartment without using my master key. I wasn't going to check coats. I was going to check the books. I picked up the heavy cardstock invitation and tapped it against my desk. This was the perfect stage. If I evicted them quietly via a process server, they could spin the story. They could tell everyone I was a vindictive, bitter woman who manipulated the system. But if I exposed them in front of 50 of the most influential people in Chicago, there would be no spin. There would only be the undeniable truth projected on a screen in high definition. I looked at the clock. The gala started in 4 hours. I picked up my phone and dialed the most expensive stylist in the city. I need a dress, I said. And I need it to be red. The kind of red that stops traffic. And send a makeup artist to the management office immediately. I then called Mike, the head of security. Mike, get 2 of your biggest guys ready for tonight. Wear suits, not uniforms. You are my entourage. And Mike, bring the file we compiled on Jamal's inventory. We are going to need it for the presentation. I looked at Vanessa's note one last time before dropping it into the shredder. She wanted me to earn some tips. By the time this night was over, I was going to give her a tip she would never forget. Never invite the landlord to a party you are throwing with stolen money. I stood up and walked to the window looking up toward the 4th floor. The stage was set. The players were in place. It was time for the execution. The industrial laser printer in the management office hummed with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. It was the heartbeat of my revenge. I stood there watching the pages slide into the output tray one by one, warm to the touch. I wasn't printing leases or eviction notices anymore. I was printing a dossier that would incinerate the social standing of the Vance family forever. I had compiled everything into a 50-page document. The first section was dedicated to Brandon. I included the full transaction history of our joint account, highlighting the unauthorized withdrawal of $12,500. I also included the credit card statements showing his purchase of a Cartier watch he claimed was a sales bonus. Next was the section on Courtney. I attached the screenshots of her Instagram stories, where she bragged about her illegal renovations, alongside her official tax returns, where she claimed to be unemployed to avoid paying state taxes. But the centerpiece was Jamal. The photos I had taken in the basement were crystal clear. You could read the serial numbers on the graphics cards. You could see the lack of import stamps on the shipping crates. I included a brief analysis I had written up citing the specific federal statutes he was violating regarding customs fraud and gray market racketeering. I didn't just staple these pages together. I treated this project with the same respect I gave my billion-dollar corporate audits. I used heavy glossy cardstock for the covers. On the front, I embossed the logo of Patricia's fake charity, the Gold Coast Children's Relief Fund, in elegant gold foil. To the naked eye, it looked exactly like the program brochure Patricia intended to hand out to her wealthy guests. It looked professional. It looked expensive. It looked trustworthy. I had 50 copies made, one for every guest on the list. On the table next to me sat 50 black velvet gift bags. Patricia had ordered these from a party supply company to give to her guests as they arrived. They were supposed to contain a cheap scented candle and a donation form asking for money. My security team had intercepted the delivery van at the loading dock 20 minutes ago. The driver didn't care as long as someone signed for the package. I took the original brochures out and tossed them into the shredder bin. Then, with surgical precision, I slipped my forensic dossiers into the velvet bags. The weight was satisfying. It felt substantial. When the guests opened these expecting to read about the plight of orphans in Haiti, they were instead going to read about the plight of a family that thought they were above the law. I ran my hand over the soft velvet of the last bag. It was a Trojan horse wrapped in silk. Patricia wanted to be the talk of the town. She wanted to be seen as a sophisticated philanthropist. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Chicago would be talking about her. They wouldn't be praising her generosity, but they would certainly remember her name. I packed the bags into a silver crate and signaled to Mike. It was time to go upstairs and help with the distribution. The party was about to start, and I didn't want anyone to miss out on the reading material. By 7 o'clock that evening, apartment 402 had been transformed into a stage set for a tragedy masked as a celebration. The lights were dimmed low to hide the scuff marks on the floor where Courtney had dragged construction equipment just hours before. The string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, their music floating over the chatter of Chicago's elite. From the outside, it looked like the height of sophistication. But from where I sat watching the security feed, it looked like a sinking ship where the band was playing on while the rats scurried for safety. Patricia was performing the role of her life. She stood at the entrance wearing the emerald green Marchesa gown she had rented. Her smile was plastered on tight, stretching the limits of her Botox. She greeted each guest with a two-handed handshake, pulling them in close to whisper about the tragic plight of the orphans she was supposedly saving. "Thank you for coming," she cooed to the wife of a bank CEO. "Your support means the world to the children. We are hoping to raise $50,000 tonight just for the foundation's operating costs." She was shameless. The only foundation she was worried about was the one cracking under her feet. I watched as the servers handed out the black velvet gift bags I had prepared. Every guest took one. The bank CEO's wife hooked hers over her wrist. A real estate tycoon tucked his under his arm. They were literally carrying the evidence of the family's corruption around the room like party favors. In the corner near the wet bar, Jamal had cornered an older gentleman named Mr. Henderson, who happened to be a prominent venture capitalist. Jamal was leaning in close, his body language aggressive and desperate. The microphone in the hallway couldn't pick up their whispers, but the camera angle was perfect. I saw Jamal pull out his phone and show Mr. Henderson a photo. It was a photo of the graphics cards in the basement. I could read Jamal's lips as he made his pitch. High yield, zero tax liability, direct import. He was soliciting a felony investment in the middle of a charity gala. He was trying to get liquid cash to move the stolen inventory before the walls closed in. Mr. Henderson looked intrigued, nodding slowly, unaware that he was being pitched a federal crime. Courtney was circulating the room with a donation tablet. She was live streaming herself, asking guests to pledge money. "Hey guys, we are here with the city's movers and shakers, raising money for the angels," she said to her phone. "Swipe up to donate directly to my Venmo, and I will make sure it gets to the charity." It was a masterclass in grift. They were extracting money from every angle using their social status as leverage. They looked so confident, so untouchable. They thought the night belonged to them. They didn't know that the elevator was currently ascending, carrying the real owner of the building. And I wasn't coming to donate. I was coming to collect. The private elevator chime sounded like a judge's gavel striking a sounding block. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the penthouse foyer. I stepped out, and for the first time in my life, I did not shrink into the background. I was wearing a floor-length crimson silk gown that hugged every curve and flowed behind me like a river of blood. It was the color of danger. It was the color of a balance sheet bleeding red. And tonight, it was the color of my revenge. Behind me stood Mike and his deputy, two men who looked less like security guards and more like a private military detail. They wore dark sunglasses even though it was night, and their tailored black suits strained against their muscles. The chatter in the living room died instantly. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing mid-measure. 50's guests turned their heads in unison. I saw Vanessa, the woman who had sent me the mocking invitation, drop her canapé onto the floor. I saw Brandon's jaw go slack. But Patricia was the first to recover. Her shock quickly morphed into a familiar mask of rage. She marched toward me, her emerald dress rustling aggressively, pushing past a stunned waiter. "You have some nerve showing your face here," she hissed loud enough for the entire room to hear. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "I told you to stay away. Did you come here to beg for scraps? Did you think because we are doing charity work that we would take pity on a stray like you?" She turned to the crowd, offering a tight, apologetic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse my former daughter-in-law. She has been having some mental health struggles since we asked her to leave. It is very sad, really." She snapped her fingers at Mike, who was standing stoically by my side. She didn't even look at him. She just barked an order like he was a dog. "Security, get this beggar out of my house immediately. Drag her out if you have to. I don't want her ruining the ambiance." The room held its breath. Everyone watched, expecting Mike to grab my arm, expecting me to be humiliated one last time. But Mike didn't move toward me. Instead, he took a step forward, positioning himself between me and Patricia. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mrs. Vance," Mike said. His voice was deep and projected clearly across the silent room. Patricia's face turned a violent shade of purple. "Excuse me, I am the one paying your salary. I said throw her out." "No, ma'am," Mike replied, calm and lethal. "You are the tenant. This is Ms. Sterling. She is the owner of Nemesis Holdings. She owns this building. And technically speaking, you are currently trespassing on her property." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens after a bomb detonates, but before the sound wave hits. Patricia froze, her hand still raised in the air, pointing at nothing. Her eyes darted from Mike to me, trying to process the impossible. I took a step forward, my red dress swishing softly against the marble floor. I looked down at her, smiling the same cold smile she had given me the night she threw me into the snow. "Hello, Patricia," I said smoothly. "I believe you are in my light. Move." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. She owns this building. I watched the reality of that sentence wash over the room in slow motion. It started with the guests. The whispers died out instantly. The clinking of crystal flutes ceased. 50 of Chicago's wealthiest elites looked from Patricia's purple face to my calm, smiling one, and the social calculus in their heads shifted immediately. They realized instantly that the power in the room had just migrated from the woman in the rented green dress to the woman in the red silk gown. Patricia was the only one who couldn't process it. Her brain simply refused to accept the data. She let out a laugh, a high-pitched manic sound that echoed uncomfortably off the marble walls. "Do not be ridiculous, Mike," she sputtered, waving her hand dismissively. "This is Audrey. She is my son's ex-wife. She is an accountant. She lives in a motel, for God's sake. She couldn't afford to buy a parking spot in this building, let alone the building itself." She turned to me, her eyes wide and desperate. "Tell him, Audrey. Tell him to stop this practical joke. It is not funny." I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Brandon. He was standing by the buffet table, gripping the edge of it so hard his knuckles were white. Unlike his mother, Brandon knew numbers. He knew I had just come into a large sum of money from the whistleblower case, even if he didn't know the exact amount. He knew the name of the LLC on the eviction notice was Nemesis Holdings. I saw the color drain from his face as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The sudden sale of the building, the immediate lease enforcement, the forensic precision of the fines. "Nemesis," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the room it sounded like a scream. You are Nemesis Holdings." I took a sip of champagne from a glass a waiter had instinctively offered me. "I am the managing partner." "Yes," I said coolly. "And I am the sole signatory on the deed." Brandon took a stumbling step forward. You are the landlord." I smiled. "Correct. Which brings me to a rather unfortunate housekeeping matter." I turned to address the room, raising my voice slightly so that every banker, lawyer, and socialite could hear me clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you have been misled." Under the terms of the residential lease agreement for Unit 402, specifically Clause 19, Section B, hosting a commercial event with paid ticket sales requires express written consent from the landlord. I paused, letting the implications sink in. I did not give that consent, which means that technically, you are all currently participating in an illegal commercial operation on private property. And as the owner, I cannot allow this liability to continue. A murmur of panic rippled through the crowd. These were people who sat on hospital boards and museum committees. The last thing they wanted was to be caught up in an illegal gambling or charity fraud bust. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing Brandon's arm. "She is lying," she shrieked. "This is my home. I have lived here for 20 years. You cannot just walk in here and declare it illegal." "Actually, Patricia," I said, setting my glass down on a passing tray. "I can. Because unlike you, I have the deed, and unlike you, I pay my bills. Now, if you don't mind, I think it is time we showed your guests exactly what their ticket money was intended to pay for. Because it certainly wasn't for orphans in Haiti." I raised my hand slightly, giving the signal to Mike, who was standing near the audio-visual controls. The string quartet had stopped playing, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. Behind Patricia, a massive projection screen had been cycling through stock photos of smiling children and inspirational quotes about generosity. It was the backdrop of her lie. Now it was about to become the instrument of her destruction. "I think it is time we watched a different kind of home movie," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor. The screen flickered. The smiling children vanished. In their place, grainy high-definition footage appeared. The timestamp in the corner read 3 months ago. The audio roared to life, filling the ballroom with the sound of a howling blizzard. On the screen, everyone saw Patricia standing in the doorway, her face twisted in a snarl. The audio was crystal clear. "You are just an extra mouth to feed, Audrey. Get your trash off my driveway." A collective gasp ripped through the room. The guests watched in horror as the on-screen Patricia threw a laptop into the snow. The sound of the screen shattering echoed against the marble walls of the penthouse. Patricia lunged toward the projector, her face pale with terror. "Turn it off!" she screamed, clawing at the air. "Someone turn it off! This is fake! It is deep fake technology!" But the video didn't stop. It cut to the next clip. Jamal appeared looking arrogant and cruel. He kicked the suitcase, sending it skidding across the ice. The guests watched him sneer. "Move it, loser. Courtney needs the room." I looked at the real Jamal standing by the bar. He wasn't sneering now. He was gripping his glass so hard I thought it might shatter. He looked around the room, realizing that every eye was fixed on him, and they were not looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him like he was a monster. The video cut again. This time it was inside the apartment. The footage showed Courtney swinging a sledgehammer into the wall, dust flying everywhere. "I am an influencer," she shouted on screen. "I don't need a permit. My mother says we own this place." The irony was palpable. The guests, who owned real estate empires of their own, exchanged dark looks. They knew exactly what unpermitted structural damage meant. It meant negligence. It meant danger. I walked closer to Patricia, who was now trembling. "You wanted these people to donate to your cause," I said calmly, pointing at the screen. "Well, there is your cause. You weren't raising money for children. You were raising money to cover up the fact that you destroyed a load-bearing wall and kicked your daughter-in-law out into a snowstorm." The video ended on a freeze frame of Brandon closing the curtains on me. The room was deadly silent. No one was eating the canapés anymore. The illusion of the Vance family as a pillar of society had been shattered, just like my laptop screen. And I hadn't even played the best clip yet. The video on the screen faded to black, leaving the image of my husband slamming the door in my face, burned into everyone's retinas. But I wasn't done. Visuals were powerful, but in my line of work, paper trails were the only things that held up in court. And I had brought plenty of paper. I took a step closer to the stunned crowd. My voice was calm, carrying a professional authority that cut through the tension. "For those of you wondering where your generous $1,000 donations were actually going to be allocated, I invite you to look inside the black velvet gift bags you are holding. You will not find a scented candle. You will not find a thank you note from an orphan in Haiti. What you will find is a 50-page forensic audit of the Vance family finances. The sound of 50 zippers opening at once filled the room like the buzzing of angry hornets. I watched as the guests pulled out the glossy booklets I had printed. They opened them expecting a brochure. Instead, they were staring at the raw, unvarnished truth of bankruptcy and fraud. I narrated the pages as they turned them, effectively giving a guided tour of the family's corruption. If you turn to page 3, you will see Patricia's current credit report. That dress she is wearing tonight, the one she told you was a vintage heirloom, was actually rented yesterday using a credit card that is currently $150,000 in default. You will also see that the funds she solicited for last year's charity ball were used to pay off her BMW lease, not to build a school. I heard a gasp from the back of the room. It was the bank CEO's wife. She was looking at Patricia with a mixture of horror and betrayal. Page 10 details the finances of my husband Brandon. I continued, relentless. You will see a withdrawal of $12,500 from our joint savings account. He labeled it Mother's Emotional Support Fee. That money was my life savings. He stole it to pay for the catering deposit for this party. So please enjoy the shrimp cocktail. I paid for it. Brandon looked like he was going to vomit. He reached out to grab the booklet from a nearby guest, but the man pulled it away, his eyes scanning the page with disgust. And finally, page 25. The business operations of Courtney and Jamal. What you are looking at are shipping manifests for illegal gray market electronics stored in the basement of this very building. Those are federal crimes, ladies and gentlemen, and by being here tonight donating to a fraudulent cause, you are all essentially accessories to money laundering. That was the tipping point. The phrase money laundering hit the room like a tear gas canister. These were people with reputations to protect, people who could not afford to be within 10 miles of a federal investigation. I saw the bank CEO grab his wife's arm. "We are leaving," he announced loudly, throwing the velvet bag onto the floor. It started a chain reaction. The room erupted into chaos. Women grabbed their furs. Men pulled out their phones, frantically calling their drivers. They weren't just leaving, they were fleeing. They dropped the dossiers on the tables, on the floor, on the trays of the confused waiters. Patricia stood in the center of the room, her arms outstretched, trying to block the exit. "No, wait," she screamed. "She is lying. It is just a spreadsheet. Don't go. We haven't served the main course yet." But nobody looked at her. Nobody stopped. They walked around her like she was a piece of furniture, avoiding eye contact. Within 2 minutes, the penthouse was empty. The only people left were the 4 members of the Vance family standing in the wreckage of their social status, and me standing on the stage watching them burn. The silence in the penthouse was short-lived. As the last guest scurried into the elevator, leaving behind a trail of abandoned velvet bags, Jamal finally snapped. The facade of the cool Wall Street banker dissolved completely, revealing the violent, desperate criminal underneath. His eyes were bloodshot and veins bulged in his neck as he looked from the projection screen to me. He realized in that moment that his entire life was over. The investors he had groomed were gone, his reputation was incinerated, and his freedom was measured in minutes. "You witch!" he screamed, his voice raw and guttural. "Do you have any idea what you just did? That was millions of dollars in capital. You just destroyed me." He didn't wait for an answer. With a roar of pure animalistic rage, Jamal lunged across the room. He moved fast, knocking over a tray of untouched champagne flutes, sending glass shattering across the marble floor. He was aiming straight for my throat, his hands curled into claws. Patricia screamed. Brandon cowered behind a sofa. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I knew something Jamal didn't. I knew that Mike was not just a building security guard. He was former Special Forces. Jamal was 3 feet away from me when Mike moved. It was a blur of motion too fast to track. One moment Jamal was charging, the next he was airborne. Mike intercepted him with a shoulder check that sounded like a car crash, then seamlessly swept his legs. Jamal hit the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud that shook the room. Before he could even draw a breath, Mike had his knee pressed into the small of Jamal's back and his arm twisted up behind him at a painful angle. "Stay down," Mike growled, pressing Jamal's face into the cold stone. "Do not move, or I will break it." Jamal thrashed against the weight, spitting curses. "Get off me! I will sue you. I will kill her. You are dead, Audrey. Do you hear me? You are dead." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. My red dress brushed against the hand he had used to grab my ankle just days before. I looked down at his face mashed against the floor, his expensive suit ruined. "Save your energy, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was far scarier than his shouting. "You are going to need it. You see, while we were watching movies up here, I had a team down in the basement." Jamal went still, his eyes widening in terror. "That is right," I continued. "The freight elevator is currently locked down because federal agents are seizing your inventory. Customs and Border Protection have been tracking that shipment from Shenzhen for months. I just gave them the key." I leaned in closer so only he could hear the final blow. "The police are waiting in the lobby, Jamal. They are not here for a noise complaint. They are here for racketeering and grand larceny. So please struggle all you want. It just adds resisting arrest to the list of charges." I stood up and smoothed my dress. I signaled to Mike, "Pick him up." The officers hate waiting. It was the most satisfying moment of my life, seeing the fear in his eyes replace the arrogance. He wasn't a wolf of Wall Street anymore. He was just a rat caught in a trap. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off Jamal's screams, and leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the penthouse. The party was over, the guests were gone, and the Vance family dynasty had effectively been decapitated. All that remained were the ruins. Courtney was the first to break the silence. She was standing by the window, frantically tapping on her phone screen. Her ring light was still on, casting a harsh, artificial glare on her tear-streaked makeup. "No," she gasped, her voice rising to a shriek that shattered the quiet. "No, no, no. This cannot be happening." She stared at her phone as if it were a bomb. I knew exactly what she was looking at. Part of my report to the authorities included flagging her social media accounts for facilitating commercial fraud. "It says account disabled," she screamed, throwing the phone onto the couch. "Permanent suspension due to violation of community guidelines regarding deceptive commercial practices." My followers. I had 200,000 followers. My brand deals. They are all gone. She looked at me with pure hatred, but I just smiled. "You didn't lose your followers, Courtney," I said calmly. "You just lost the ability to lie to them." While Courtney mourned the death of her digital ego, Brandon was processing a much more tangible threat. He looked around the empty room, then at the eviction notice on the floor, and finally at me. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was jobless, homeless, and his brother-in-law was in handcuffs. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He folded. Brandon walked toward me, his legs shaking. He didn't look like the man who had thrown my clothes into garbage bags. He looked like a frightened child. "Audrey," he choked out, reaching for my hand. "Baby, please. We can fix this." I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about Jamal's business. I was a victim too. I stepped back, letting his hand grasp at empty air. "Don't lie to me, Brandon," I said, cold as ice. "You knew exactly where the money came from. You just didn't care as long as it paid for your cigars." He collapsed. He actually fell to his knees right there on the marble floor in front of me. He grabbed the hem of my red silk dress, burying his face in the fabric, sobbing uncontrollably. "I am sorry," he wailed. "I will do anything. I will sign a post-nuptial. I will sleep on the couch. Just don't kick us out. Please, Audrey, I still love you." The sight of him groveling at my feet was pathetic. It wasn't satisfying. It was repulsive. This was the man I had devoted 5 years of my life to, this weak, spineless creature who only loved me when I held the checkbook. I looked down at his tear-stained face, smearing snot onto my couture gown. I felt nothing but disgust. I shifted my weight and extended my leg, catching him squarely in the chest with the point of my toe. It wasn't a violent kick, but it was firm enough to knock him backward onto his heels. "Get off me!" I snapped, pulling my dress away from his grasping hands. He looked up at me, stunned. "Stand up, Brandon," I said, dusting off the fabric where he had touched me. "And do not dirty my $1,000 shoes with your crocodile tears. You look pathetic." I turned away from him, leaving him kneeling on the floor. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I had taken down the heavy hitter. I had neutralized the noise. Now there was only one person left standing. The matriarch. The woman who started it all. I turned slowly to face Patricia. I stepped over Brandon, who was still weeping, into the carpet, and walked toward the fireplace where Patricia was standing. She looked like a statue of a deposed queen. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling, and her eyes were darting around the room as if searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. For the first time in the 5 years I had known her, she was completely silent. The venom was gone, replaced by the hollow realization that she was no longer in control. I signaled to Mike. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a document folded in thirds. It wasn't a thick dossier like the forensic audit. It was a single sheet of paper with a red court stamp at the top. I took the paper and held it out to her. She didn't take it. She just stared at it as if it were contaminated with a deadly virus. "Take it, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing in the empty ballroom. "It is the only thing I am going to give you tonight." Her hand shook violently as she reached out and snatched the paper. She brought it close to her face, squinting to read the legal text through her tears. "Emergency order for possession," she whispered, reading the header. "Immediate vacancy required due to criminal activity and hazardous lease violations." She looked up at me, her lip quivering. "You can't do this. Evictions take months. You have to give us 30 days' notice. That is the law." I smiled a cold, humorless smile. "Under normal circumstances, you would be right. But you see, Patricia, when your son-in-law was arrested for federal racketeering on the premises, and when your daughter destroyed the structural integrity of the building, you forfeited your tenant rights. This is an emergency eviction order signed by a judge less than an hour ago. It grants Nemesis Holdings immediate possession of the property to secure the safety of the building." I checked the diamond watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8:30. "That means you are currently trespassing," I continued. "But because I am feeling generous, I am going to give you a grace period." I looked at Brandon, who had stopped crying and was now staring at me in horror. I looked at Courtney, who was hugging her knees on the sofa. And finally, I locked eyes with Patricia. "You have exactly 60 minutes. 60 minutes, Patricia gasped. "That is impossible. We have furniture. We have clothes. We have heirlooms. How are we supposed to move 20 years of life in an hour?" "That is not my problem," I said. "You have 60 minutes to pack whatever you can carry and get out of my building. Grab your jewelry. Grab your furs. Grab whatever fits in your pockets. Because at 9:30 sharp, the locks will be changed." I took a step closer, invading her personal space, just as she had done to me so many times. And Patricia listened closely. "Anything left inside this apartment at 9:31 becomes the property of the landlord. And I will treat it exactly how you treated my property." I pointed to the spot on the floor where the projection screen had shown her throwing my laptop. "I will have the maintenance crew shovel every antique vase, every designer dress, and every family photo into heavy-duty trash bags. And then I will have them throw it all into the dumpster in the alley, just like you threw my career into the snow." Patricia's mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. She realized I wasn't bluffing. She realized that the cruelty she had taught me had been perfected. "Tick-tock, mother," I whispered. "The clock is running." I turned on my heel and walked toward the door, motioning for Mike to follow. I wasn't going to watch them pack. I was going to wait in the lobby and watch them leave. The panic that erupted behind me as I closed the door was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. They were scrambling like rats on a sinking ship, and the water was rising fast. At exactly 9:29, the heavy mahogany door of apartment 402 burst open. It did not swing wide with the elegance of a grand entrance. It slammed against the wall with the desperate, frantic energy of a sinking ship. The Vance family stumbled into the hallway, and they looked nothing like the dynasty that had ruled this floor for 20 years. They looked like refugees fleeing a war zone they had started. Patricia was the first one out. She was not walking, she was hauling. In her manicured hands, she gripped the leather straps of two massive Louis Vuitton trunks. She was dragging them across the carpet, her heels slipping and sliding as she fought against the weight. Her hair was a bird's nest. Her makeup was streaked with sweat and mascara. She was muttering to herself a stream of profanities that would have made a sailor blush. Behind her came Brandon. He was carrying an armful of suits on hangers and a box of cigars that was spilling onto the floor. He looked shell-shocked. His eyes were wide and empty. He wasn't helping his mother. He was just trying to save his Italian wool blazers. Courtney brought up the rear. She was sobbing hysterically, dragging a garment bag with one hand and holding a ring light with the other, refusing to leave behind her equipment, even as she lost her home. But the hallway was not empty. I had not cleared the floor. In fact, I had sent a notification to the other tenants that there would be a disturbance on the 4th floor. As Patricia rounded the corner toward the elevators, she stopped dead in her tracks. Lined up against the walls were her neighbors. The people she had sneered at in the lobby. The people she had complained about in the HOA meetings. The people she had called trash. They were all there, and every single one of them had their phone out. The hallway was lit up by the harsh glare of a dozen camera flashes. It was a paparazzi walk of shame. Mrs. Higgins from apartment 404 was live streaming. The young couple from 406 were recording with gleeful smiles. Patricia tried to shield her face with her arm. "Stop it!" she shrieked. "Stop filming me! This is harassment! I will sue you all!" As she screamed, she yanked hard on her trunk, trying to rush toward the elevator. But the bag was overstuffed. With a loud snap, the leather handle tore clean off. The trunk tipped over, spilling its contents onto the hallway floor. It wasn't piles of cash or jewels that fell out. It was a heap of polyester clothes and cheap knockoff handbags. A purse that looked like a Chanel rolled to the feet of Mrs. Higgins. She kicked it gently with her slipper. "Plastic," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I always knew she was a fake. Look at the stitching. It is a counterfeit." The neighbors laughed. It was a cruel sound, a release of years of pent-up resentment. Patricia scrambled on her hands and knees, trying to stuff the fake bags back into the trunk. She looked up at them, her eyes burning with humiliation. "Get out of my way," she hissed. She didn't head for the main elevator with the gold doors. Her key fob for that one had already been deactivated. She had to drag her broken trunk to the service elevator. The freight lift. The one used for garbage and deliveries. The one she had forced me to use so many times because she didn't want the help to be seen. Brandon pressed the button frantically. The heavy metal doors groaned open, revealing the scuffed steel interior that smelled of cleaning fluid. They piled in, throwing their bags on top of each other. Patricia was the last one in. She turned around to face her audience, clutching the broken handle of her fake designer bag. The neighbors didn't say goodbye. They just kept filming. As the steel doors slid shut, cutting off her view of the luxury world she had just lost, the last thing she saw was the flashing lights of the cameras documenting her fall. She was finally going down to the level where she belonged. The lobby of the Ellington was no longer a quiet sanctuary of marble and gold leaf. It had been transformed into a chaotic theater of flashing blue and red lights. I stood near the concierge desk, my arms crossed, watching the revolving doors spin. Outside, a swarm of news vans had already blocked the driveway. I had made a few anonymous calls to the city desk editors of the Chicago Tribune and the local news stations, promising them a scoop about a massive federal raid involving high finance fraud and luxury real estate. They did not disappoint. The elevator chimed, but it wasn't the service elevator carrying Patricia and her fake luggage. It was the main car. The doors slid open, and the flashbulbs erupted like a lightning storm. Jamal was not walking out with the dignity of a misunderstood genius. He was being frog-marched by two federal agents, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. His Italian suit was ripped at the shoulder from his struggle in the penthouse, and his tie was hanging loose around his neck like a noose. When the reporters saw him, they surged forward, thrusting microphones over the heads of the police line. "Mr. Vance, is it true you were running a smuggling ring out of a residential building?" one reporter shouted. "Are the allegations of tax fraud connected to your hedge fund?" another screamed. Jamal looked like a trapped animal. He blinked rapidly against the blinding strobe of the cameras. He tried to duck his head, but the agents held him upright, forcing him to face the media. Then his eyes locked onto me. I was standing calmly by a marble pillar just out of the fray. I raised my glass of champagne in a silent toast. That was the spark that ignited him. Jamal lunged toward me, straining against the metal cuffs. He began to scream, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You did this!" he roared, spitting as he shouted. "This is a setup! She is a liar! I will sue you, Audrey! Do you hear me? I will sue you for everything you have! My lawyers will destroy you!" The agents didn't even flinch. They simply tightened their grip and shoved him forward toward the glass doors. "Move it!" the lead agent barked. "I am innocent!" Jamal shrieked, his face turning a mottled red. "This is entrapment. I demand to speak to my attorney. You cannot arrest me. I am a job creator. I am a pillar of this community." He was still screaming as they pushed him through the revolving doors and out into the freezing Chicago night. The cold air hit him, and for a second he went silent. Then he saw the back of the police cruiser waiting for him. The reality of his future finally landed. He tried to dig his heels into the pavement, refusing to get in, but the officer simply placed a hand on top of his head and forced him down. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer recited, his voice bored, and practiced cutting through Jamal's ranting. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal was still shouting threats about lawsuits and vengeance as they slammed the heavy car door shut. The sound was final, a dull thud that signaled the end of his career, his reputation, and his freedom. I watched through the glass as the cruiser pulled away, lights, siren blaring, fading into the city traffic. The flashbulbs died down. The reporters began to pack up their gear, checking their footage. They had their headline. The Wolf of Lakeshore Drive had just been caged, and the person holding the key was the woman he had called a loser. I took a sip of my drink. It was cold, crisp, and tasted like absolute victory. 1 down, 3 to go. Here is the detailed script for segment 31, written in English, optimized for AI voiceover. The show in the lobby was over. The police cruisers had faded into the night, taking Jamal and his delusions of grandeur with them. The reporters were packing up their cameras, disappointed that the main attraction was gone. I walked out of the revolving doors and felt the biting Chicago wind hit my face. It was raining now, a freezing sleet that coated the sidewalk in a sheet of gray slush. But unlike the night they kicked me out, I wasn't shivering. I was wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than Brandon's car, and my driver Thomas was waiting at the curb. He was standing next to a sleek midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom, holding the rear door open with a white-gloved hand. It was a purchase I had made yesterday, a final treat to myself for closing the deal on the building. I stepped toward the car, my heels clicking rhythmically on the wet pavement. I was 1 foot inside the plush leather interior when I heard it. A desperate, cracking voice screaming my name. "Audrey, wait. Please wait." I paused and looked back. Brandon was sprinting out of the building. He wasn't wearing a coat. His Italian suit was already soaked through, clinging to his frame like a second skin. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He looked like a man who had just realized he had thrown away a diamond to pick up a rock. He reached the car, gasping for air, and grabbed the edge of the open door, his wet hands staining the leather. "Baby, please don't go," he begged, water dripping from his nose. "You can't leave me here with them. My mother is insane, Audrey. You saw her. She made me do those things. She poisoned me against you." I looked at him. I looked at the man I had cooked for, cleaned for, and supported for 5 years. I looked for a shred of the man I thought I loved, but there was nothing there. Just a coward trying to find a new host to leech off of. "I love you, Audrey," he sobbed, wiping his eyes with a wet sleeve. "I always loved you. I was just scared. I was weak. But we can start over. Just you and me. I will testify against Jamal. I will testify against Mom. Just let me in the car. Please. I am cold." He tried to step inside, his muddy shoe hovering over the lamb's wool floor mat. I didn't push him. I didn't shout. I simply signaled to Thomas. Thomas stepped forward and firmly removed Brandon's hand from the door. "Sir, please step back from the vehicle," Thomas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Brandon stumbled back onto the sidewalk, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "But Audrey," he whispered. I sat back against the warm seat and looked him dead in the eye. "You are not cold, Brandon," I said softly. "You are just alone, and you are going to have to get used to it." I pulled the door shut. The heavy latch clicked, sealing me inside a silent world of luxury. As the car began to glide forward, Brandon started to run. He ran alongside the moving vehicle, tapping frantically on the glass. "Audrey," he screamed, his voice muffled by the soundproofing. "Audrey, I am sorry." I didn't look away. I watched him run. I reached for the control panel on the armrest and pressed the button for the window. The dark-tinted glass slid up smoothly, erasing his face, erasing his voice, and erasing his existence from my life. The Rolls-Royce accelerated, merging into the traffic of Lakeshore Drive. I watched in the side mirror as Brandon stopped running. He stood there, a lonely figure in the rain, getting smaller and smaller until he was just a speck in the distance. I turned my head and looked forward at the city skyline. The rain was still falling, but inside the car it was perfectly dry. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me. It was a text from my real estate agent regarding a penthouse in Paris. I smiled and picked it up. I had a new life to build, and I wasn't going to look back. 3 months had passed since the night the flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the lobby walls blue. The winter snow had melted away, revealing the first green shoots of spring along Lakeshore Drive. But inside the Ellington Heights, the transformation was even more profound. I stood in the center of what used to be apartment 402, wearing a hard hat and holding a set of blueprints. The space was unrecognizable. The heavy, suffocating velvet drapes that Patricia loved were gone. In their place were floor-to-ceiling windows that let the natural light flood in, washing away years of gloom. The smell of stale cigar smoke and cloying rose perfume had been replaced by the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and fresh white paint. I took a deep breath. For the first time in 5 years, the air in this apartment didn't feel heavy. It felt free. I walked over to the wall that Courtney had destroyed with her sledgehammer. My contractors had not just patched it up. They had reinforced it with a steel beam, which I decided to leave exposed, and painted a matte industrial black. It was no longer a symbol of reckless vanity. It was a pillar of strength. We were turning this room into the main reading lounge. I ran my hand along the new built-in shelving units that lined the perimeter. They were made of warm oak, and they were currently empty, waiting to be filled. I had decided against renting the unit out. I didn't want another family here. I didn't want to risk another Patricia. Instead, I was gifting the space back to the building. Apartment 402 was officially becoming the Sterling Library, a communal workspace and reading room for all the residents of the building. Where Patricia had once held court and judged her neighbors, there would now be comfortable leather armchairs where those same neighbors could sit and read in peace. Where Brandon had hidden away to smoke his cigars and ignore his wife, there was now a high-tech conference pod for remote workers. And where Courtney had set up her ring lights to film her lies, there was now a children's corner filled with colorful beanbags and educational games. A contractor named Jim walked up to me, wiping plaster from his hands. "Ms. Sterling, we just finished tearing out the master bath." "You were right. The plumbing was a disaster waiting to happen. We found mold behind the gold-plated tiles." I smiled. Of course there was mold. The Vance family had been rotting from the inside out for years. The gold plating was just a facade to hide the decay. "Rip it all out, Jim," I said. "Every pipe, every tile. I want everything that was theirs gone. I want this place sterilized." I walked out onto this balcony, the very spot where I used to stand, and looked down at the city, feeling trapped. Now I looked out at the skyline and felt like I owned it, because I literally did. I had scrubbed their existence from the building. Their names were removed from the buzzer. Their mail was returned to sender. And now even the physical imprint of their lives was being sanded down and painted over. I looked down at the blueprints one last time. The label at the bottom read, "Project Rebirth." It was fitting. I wasn't just renovating a room. I was reclaiming a sanctuary. The Vance family had used this space to exclude people, to make them feel small. I was turning it into a place that welcomed everyone. It was the ultimate insult to Patricia's legacy. She wanted a fortress. I built a community, and the best part was that every time a resident checked out a book or sat by the window, they would be enjoying the view that she had killed to keep. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my new office in the penthouse of the Ellington. The space was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled these rooms 3 months ago. On my desk sat a single manila envelope. It was not an invoice or a legal summons. It was the final status report from the private investigator I had hired to tie up the loose ends of the Vance administration. I didn't need to know where they were for my safety. The restraining orders took care of that. I needed to know where they were for my peace of mind. I needed to confirm that the balance of the universe had been restored. I picked up my letter opener, a heavy silver blade that felt cool in my hand, and sliced the seal. I slid the photographs and typed reports onto the mahogany surface. The first file was labeled Patricia Vance. The address listed was not in the Gold Coast. It wasn't even in Lincoln Park. It was a subsidized housing complex on the far south side, a place known more for its sirens than its skyline views. The photograph clipped to the file showed a woman who looked 20 years older than the one I had evicted. Patricia was standing on a cracked concrete balcony that was barely large enough for a single plastic chair. She was wearing a faded bathrobe, not silk, but a pilling polyester blend. I read the investigator's notes. Patricia Vance had been denied 3 rental applications due to poor credit history and a flag for previous eviction proceedings. She was currently residing in a state-assisted efficiency unit. The report described her daily routine. There were no more bridge clubs, no more galas. Her days were now spent arguing with the building superintendent about the lack of hot water and fighting with her neighbors about the noise. The investigator had included a transcript of a noise complaint she had filed. It read, "The tenant in 4B claims she is a dignitary and demands silence. Neighbors report she shouts at the television and attempts to order the mailman around like a servant." I looked at the photo again. The arrogance was still there in the set of her jaw, but her eyes were empty. She was a queen without a kingdom ruling over a realm of peeling paint and linoleum floors. She was finally living the life she had falsely accused me of having. She was the burden. She was the extra mouth that society was now reluctantly feeding. I turned the page to the second file. Courtney Vance. The location listed was a 24-hour diner off the interstate, a place where truckers stopped for greasy eggs and black coffee. The photo showed Courtney in a uniform that was a far cry from her designer athleisure. She was wearing a stained brown apron and a hairnet. Her face, usually contoured to perfection, was shiny with sweat and bare of makeup. She looked exhausted. The report detailed her financial collapse. After her social media accounts were permanently banned for fraud, her income stream evaporated overnight. The brands she had partnered with sued her for breach of contract to recover their advance payments. She had been forced to sell her camera equipment, her ring lights, and even her phone just to pay the legal fees. Now she was working the graveyard shift at a diner to make ends meet. I read the observation log. Subject was observed waiting tables during the lunch rush. Subject was reprimanded by the shift manager for checking her reflection in the napkin dispenser instead of bussing tables. Subject appears to be living in a shared studio apartment with 3 other roommates. The irony was delicious. Courtney, who had once made a living pretending to serve her followers, was now actually serving people. And she wasn't doing it for likes. She was doing it for tips. She was doing it because she had no other choice. The girl who had mocked me for working late nights was now scrubbing grease off a griddle at 3 in the morning. She had wanted to be famous. Now she was just anonymous help, a ghost in a brown apron refilling ketchup bottles for people who didn't even look her in the eye. I moved to the final file. Brandon Vance. This one was the thinnest, but it held the most weight. Attached to the front was a photocopy of an official document from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. It was a notice of revocation. Following the investigation into the gray market electronics found in the basement and his complicity in the fraudulent charity gala, the state board had stripped Brandon of his real estate license. He was permanently barred from brokering, selling, or managing property in the state of Illinois. The career he had built on his mother's name and my hard work was gone. The surveillance photo showed him sitting on a park bench in downtown Chicago. He wasn't wearing an Italian suit. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting jacket that looked like it came from a thrift store. He was holding a stack of flyers. The investigator's note explained that Brandon had taken a job handing out advertisements for a discount car insurance company. I looked at his face in the picture. He looked defeated. This was a man who used to drive a Mercedes. A man who used to brag about his closing rates while I balanced his checkbook. Now he was standing on a street corner, ignored by passers-by, trying to force a piece of paper into the hands of people who walked around him like he was an obstacle. He had called me a loser. He had told me I had no ambition. Now he was the one standing on the outside looking in. He had lost his license, his wife, his home, and his dignity. He was back to being exactly what he was before I met him, a man with no direction, only this time, he didn't have a mother with a mansion to hide him. I stacked the files back together and slid them into the envelope. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel the need to laugh. I just felt a quiet, solid sense of completion. The scales had balanced. They were all exactly where they belonged. Patricia was in the squalor she feared. Courtney was doing the labor she despised. And Brandon was facing the mediocrity he was born for. I walked over to the shredder in the corner of my office. I didn't need to keep these files. I didn't need to look at them again. I fed the envelope into the machine and watched as the faces of the Vance family were sliced into thousands of unreadable confetti strips. The machine whirred and then fell silent. It was done. They were the past. I turned my back on the shredder and looked out at the city of Chicago. The sun was shining on the lake, turning the water into a sheet of diamonds. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was the contractor for the library project asking for approval on the final lighting fixtures. I smiled. I had a building to run. I had a life to live. And for the first time in a long time, the view from the top was absolutely perfect. The sun was beginning to set over Lake Michigan, turning the water into a vast sheet of molten gold. I stood on the penthouse balcony, leaning against the warm railing that I now owned. In my hand, I held a glass of vintage Bordeaux. It was rich, dark, and complex, much like the life I had built from the ashes of my marriage. The wind up here was no longer a biting enemy, trying to freeze me to death. It was a gentle caress, a reminder that I had climbed above the storm. I looked down at the street below. From this height, the cars looked like toys, and the people were just specks. Somewhere down there in the maze of the city, Brandon was handing out flyers. Somewhere in a diner, Courtney was wiping a table. And somewhere in a concrete box, Patricia was staring at a wall, wondering where it all went wrong. They had lived their lives believing that power was something you were born with, something you inherited like a trust fund or a last name. They thought power was shouting at waiters and buying things you couldn't afford. They never understood that real power is quiet. Real power is patience. Real power is the ability to take the stones people throw at you and use them to build a fortress. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the flavor linger on my tongue. I thought about the night they threw me out. I thought about the suitcase skidding across the ice. I thought about the insults they hurled at me like garbage. They called me a burden. They called me a leech. But most of all, they called me an extra mouth to feed. I smiled a genuine smile that reached my eyes. That was their fatal mistake. They looked at me and saw only a liability. They saw a stomach that needed filling. They never stopped to look at the teeth. They never stopped to think about what happens when you starve a predator. They forgot that this mouth was the very thing that would swallow them whole. I wasn't just an accountant. I was the reckoning they never saw coming. I was the karma they thought they could outrun. They thought they were the main characters in a story about wealth and status. They didn't realize they were just the villains in my origin story. I turned away from the view and walked back into the warmth of my living room. The library was quiet, waiting for the residents to arrive tomorrow. My life was full. My ledger was balanced, and my debts were paid in full. I raised my glass one last time to the empty room, to the ghosts of the people who used to live here, and to the woman who survived them. Never underestimate a woman backed into a corner. She might just buy the building you are standing in. The most profound lesson from Audrey's journey is that true power is never loud. It is calculated, competent, and often invisible until it is too late. The Vance family represents a trap that many fall into, the belief that status, appearance, and social standing are shields that protect you from the consequences of your actions. They believe that because they lived in a penthouse and wore designer clothes, they were superior to the woman who balanced their books. They mistook Audrey's silence for weakness and her patience for submission. This arrogance was their downfall. This story serves as a brutal reminder that you should never judge someone by their current circumstances. When the Vances kicked Audrey out into the snow, they didn't realize they were stripping away the only thing keeping their house of cards from collapsing. They failed to understand that real wealth is not about spending money, it is about understanding how money works. Audrey's weapon wasn't just the settlement check she received. It was her financial literacy, her knowledge of the law, and her ability to see the truth behind the facade. Ultimately, the narrative teaches us that the person you mistreat today could be the one holding the keys to your destiny tomorrow. Cruelty is an expensive luxury that no one can truly afford. The Vances paid for their arrogance with their home, their reputation, and their future. It is a warning to treat everyone with dignity, not because of who they are, but because of who they might become when they are pushed into a corner. If you enjoyed watching the tables turn and want to hear more stories about justice, resilience, and the sweet taste of revenge, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. See you in the next story.